July 2nd, 1944, Cherbourg, France. At 11 a.m., a figure dressed in white emerged from a camouflaged opening among the ruins. Dr. Schwester Ilse Schultz kept her eyes half closed in front of the light she hadn't seen in days. The day before, she had told the other nurses that the Americans were bluffing. They don't have medical supplies, only propaganda. That comment was the last intact conviction. The light that hit her did not come only from the Normandy sun. It came from a reality that no doctrine of the German Red Cross had prepared to face. Within hours, she and 8 other nurses would be flown to American medical facilities operating on an industrial scale, where plasma was refrigerated, antibiotics were plentiful, and even enemy prisoners received specialized care. There, what collapsed were not trenches but certainties. This documentary will narrate the transformation of these professionals, trained under a medicine of race war, in the face of the technical, logistical, and moral abundance of the enemy. The promise is not about tanks or battles. It's about the moment when medicine, treated as an ideological weapon by a regime, was reintroduced as science and compassion, and won without firing a shot. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any image. In 1945, the United States produced 6.8 trillion units of penicillin. Nazi Germany, even at its industrial peak, failed to manufacture any. While Wehrmacht soldiers died from trivial infections, American nurses discarded syringes and healed with a device that to their enemies seemed to belong to science fiction. This is the scale of the difference that will be revealed, and that those prisoners in white coats witnessed with their own eyes. If you value the preservation of historical memory, the rigor of data, and the reconstruction of forgotten truths, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content. This helps the canal continue to excavate the history where she was buried, with scalpels, not guns. In the days leading up to the surrender at Cherbourg, German Red Cross nurses still believed in the myth of German logistical superiority. They had been trained to rely on discipline, precision, and sacrifice as tools of victory. The American enemy, they said, was disorganized, mixed, impure, a paper colossus, propped up by propaganda and improvisation. But as they were led through the tented corridors of the 45th American Evacuation Hospital, belief began to crack. There, the sound was not of screams or engines, but of constant cooling. Units of plasma kept at just the right temperatures, ready for application. The stretchers were covered with clean, disposable sheets. The serums dripped onto standardized supports. What the nurses saw was a production line of life. Behind the scenes, the machinery that underpinned that operation was even harder to comprehend. Maritime convoys protected by broken code, C-47 planes converted into air ambulances, hospital trains with a capacity for hundreds of wounded people a day. Each battlefield was followed by a portable public health system, not improvised but provided for in manuals. In North Africa, in just 3 months, the United States managed to land 1,500 tons of medical supplies, the equivalent of more than a year's worth of German production in times of scarcity. One of the prisoners in a later letter wrote, "They didn't look like soldiers, but they carried everything as if they were supplying an entire city, not just an army." The shock increased when they realized that the discards were part of the protocol. Used bandages were burned, syringes were replaced, instruments passed through electric autoclaves instead of being boiled manually. In his training, reuse was a virtue. In American practice, it was backwardness. And then came the number that destroyed pride. In 1943, the United States built a Liberty ship every 4 days. It took Germany 3 years to manufacture all the ships of the type that operated in the Baltic. If this comparison surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins." Because that's what the nurses understood there, that it wasn't just a war of weapons, but of capabilities. And the Americans were operating at a level of production that transcended the war. It was a salvation industry. The vehicles carrying ammunition also carried plasma. The hangars that produced tanks on the night shift packed morphine. In 1944, the American production of sulfa powder was 10 times greater than the entire pharmaceutical capacity of the Reich. And contrary to what they expected, this abundance was not accompanied by arrogance. The soldiers unloading the medical trucks did not wear medals. Many were black, others spoke Spanish. There were those who wore glasses, those who did not wear polished boots, those who chewed gum while working. That, to the indoctrinated mind, was not an army, It was a disorganized crowd. But behind the scenes, the precision was absolute. Each box was catalogued, each medicine tracked, each dose accounted for, and more than that, distributed without distinction of race, origin, or side of the war. What for the nurses was visual insubordination was revealed, in practice, as a democratic efficiency. None of them could understand how such a plural system could be so coordinated. How could a country with African American soldiers, despised by the Aryan doctrine of purity, assemble a medical network so effective that it made the Wehrmacht look artisanal? One of the nurses even recorded, "They beat us with boxes, not with bullets, with food, not with punishment, and with machines that we didn't know how to operate." And perhaps the most shocking was yet to come, because if until then they had only witnessed supplies, in the next step, they would touch the tools that would change everything: disposable scalpels, oximeters, portable X-ray, modern anesthesia, a surgical arsenal that would make the doctrine look medieval. What began as a logistical astonishment was about to turn into a technical collapse. May 1943. Under the scorching Tunisian sun, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim signs the surrender of the Afrika Korps. Along with 250,000 German and Italian soldiers, hundreds of German Red Cross doctors, nurses, and assistants are taken prisoner by Allied forces. For them, captured in blood-stained lab coats and sand-covered boots, fate seemed inevitable: exemplary punishment, forced labor, perhaps oblivion in some camp in the interior of the United States. After all, this is how they had learned to treat the defeated, and that is how they expected to be treated. But what they received in the early days dismantled an expectation carefully built by years of indoctrination. At collection points in Tunis, even before any interrogation, American medical officials separated the health workers from the other prisoners. Nurses were taken to climate-controlled tents, fed standard American feed, examined by triage teams, and advised of their rights under the Geneva Convention. Hot baths were offered. Corrective lenses supplied. One of them, Greta Falk, registered as D.R.K. Schwester with a decoration of the Iron Cross Second Class, wrote, "I was treated with more dignity by the enemies than by many colleagues in our own command." The structure that supported this treatment went beyond diplomacy. It was the reflection of a medical apparatus that functioned as an integral part of the American war machine. Instead of improvising wards, the United States had loaded entire hospitals onto the Liberty ships. Mobile surgical structures, sterilization systems, plasma coolers, technical libraries. Each ship was, by definition, a complete medical unit. German women, accustomed to surgery in poorly ventilated basements and improvised transfusions, found themselves surrounded by a standard of care that defied even the great university hospitals of the Reich. The first ethical surprise came there. They were being cared for that German civilians had never seen, and from an enemy that their propaganda said was weak, degenerate, and incapable. The collapse began quietly. In the prisoner triage room, the nurses noticed something they couldn't explain. The pattern was the same for everyone: Americans, Italians, Germans. There was no segregation of resources between allies and captives. The plasma, the penicillin, the food, everything was offered in exact doses, following protocol and not ideology. The logistical data was overwhelming. In Operation Torch, between November 1942 and March 1943, the United States landed more than 300 tons of medicines and 800 tons of hospital equipment in North Africa alone. The production of plasma, embedded in glass bottles with autonomous refrigeration, exceeded 10,000 units per week. Germany, by comparison, used direct human-to-human transfusion with a high infection rate. One of the prisoners recorded, "I thought it was a lie, that it was theater, but their precision in caring, it didn't look like staging. It was reality." When they landed in the United States weeks later, the psychological impact intensified. The sea voyage was not made in holds, but in adapted compartments with wards. Each prisoner was provided with a blanket, hygiene kit, and regular meals. The racial doctrine, which taught that mixed-blood Americans would never have discipline, was put to the test by logistics operators who never spoke loudly, but who recorded every drug entry and exit with almost clinical calm. The trains that transported them from Norfolk to countryside revealed another dimension. The landscapes were intact, the cities supplied, The hospitals active. There were no signs of extreme rationing as in Berlin. What seemed like a nation mired in crisis revealed itself as a country supplied, organized, and in continuous production. Upon arriving at Camp Opelika, Alabama, the reports became even more symbolic. The camp hospital was better equipped than many Reich clinics. Surgical instruments were washed in electric autoclaves. Medical records were filled out in duplicate with the use of carbon. Even the patient's identification bracelets contained blood type and allergy data, an innovation most of the prisoners had never seen. But the real shock did not come from the machines. It came from the gesture. When one of the nurses fell ill with typhoid fever, she was not isolated or ridiculed. She was taken care of, with American serum, antibiotics, and individual attention. What she understood on that stretcher was more devastating than any bombing. There, even though she was an enemy, she was treated like life. And the doctrine, which said that life had value according to race and function, had no explanation for this. If the Americans, the same ones she had been trained to despise, healed without asking loyalty, then what was left of the logic that had guided her there? The break was still subtle. None of them confessed defeat. But night after night the conversations changed. Less about honor, more about protocols, less about race, more about antibiotics. Ideological discourse began to be replaced by professional curiosity, and the silent doubt took shape. If they take better care, what else have they done better than us? A question that would take on another dimension when, weeks later, the nurses would be led to touch for the first time the surgical instruments that not only worked, but surpassed everything they had ever imagined. Because what came next was no longer just a humanitarian gesture. It was a medical arsenal that seemed to have come from the future. The first time a German nurse saw an American operating room, she thought she was standing on a movie set. It was impossible, she said to herself, that this room with its electric dimmable lighting, tables adjustable by hydraulic pistons and sterile instrumentation panels was real, but it was. And what for her was fiction, for Americans it was standard. At hospitals like Glennon General, Fort Robinson, and Camp Forest, American medical technology wasn't a luxury. It was protocol. Portable X-ray machines, capable of identifying fractures in minutes. Electrocardiographs recording heart rhythms with graphic accuracy, even in tents. Autoclaves that sterilized equipment in minutes, without the need to manually boil utensils for hours. In contrast, German field medicine still relied on charcoal stoves, repurposed blades, and bandages boiled with coarse salt. By 1943, while the United States was manufacturing more than 15,000 X-ray machines for military and civilian use, Germany was relying on units that had been confiscated or assembled with scarce spare parts. The prisoners watched in silence as American doctors analyzed contrast light scans, applied valve-metered anesthesia, and, with disconcerting frequency, saved limbs that, under German command, would be amputated. American medicine possessed something even more destructive to Nazi ideology than Sherman tanks or B-17 bombers: technical predictability. Each device, each gesture, each medication followed an industrial logic of repetition, control, and scale. It was an assembly line medicine, but not of death, but of recovery. The surgical instruments were packaged in sealed kits, sterilized in a controlled environment, and replaced after use, without hesitation. For professionals trained to operate in scarcity, this was heresy. But there, if something fell to the ground, it wasn't cleaned. It was discarded. German doctrine taught to value effort. The American prioritized the result. The nurses who had spent years memorizing the names of Aryan doctors began to repeat new terms: oxygenation, cardiac index, triage unit, cross-protocol. None of that was part of his original training. At one point, one of the prisoners with experience on the Russian front whispered to the other, "If we had half of that in Stalingrad, we could have saved an entire battalion." The phrase echoed like a confession, not of guilt, but of dazzle. In their confiscated notebooks, Allied officers found almost obsessive notes on American equipment, drawings of pulmonary ventilators, specifications of electric autoclaves, reports on the operation of asepsis rooms. It was as if, in the face of the collapse of ideology, these women clung to the only thing that still made sense: technique. But even that no longer belonged to them, because the equipment they knew from books, and which they believed unreachable, was now in front of them. operating under the hands of an enemy considered inferior. It was material proof that they had been deceived. If American medicine was backward, how to explain the fact that, in 1944, the U.S. Army was already using portable gasoline-powered refrigerators to conserve insulin, while Germany sent diabetic patients home due to lack of stock? How can we justify that, while Germany delivered morphine with glass syringes sterilized in boiling water, the United States already used stainless steel syringes with safety locks? Each piece of American equipment was a reminder that the enemy didn't just outsmart them, it left them decades behind. And all of this was possible for a reason they knew but refused to accept: mass production. The Americans didn't just design innovations, they multiplied them. By July 1944, General Electric factories were producing an electrocardiograph unit every 4 hours. It took Germany 2 years to produce 100 similar units. The United States didn't win because it was smarter. It won because it had scale. And scale, in medicine, was synonymous with survival. If an American soldier was wounded in the field, he could be under safe anesthesia in less than 30 minutes, even on foreign soil. The same situation on the German Eastern Front would in most cases end with amputation or death from infection. Nazi medicine was selective, rigid, nationalistic. The American was modular, adaptable, and universal. And in the face of this, the belief in his own superiority began to crumble. But what these nurses didn't yet know is that it wasn't just technology that would disarm them. What came next would call into question something even deeper: the racial hierarchy that underpinned the entire Reich medical system. Because soon, they would be supervised by professionals who, according to their doctrine, should not even know how to read. In the months following the capture, German nurses were assigned to American military hospitals that operated to an organizational pattern they had never witnessed. Glennon General in Oklahoma, Fort Robinson in Nebraska, Camp Opelika in Alabama, names that at first glance seemed just places of internment. But each of these hospitals was in effect a living laboratory of modern medicine. There, the prisoners didn't just watch, they were integrated. Guided by protocols of the Geneva Convention, they received supervised tasks, participated in wards, assisted in surgeries. And for the first time, they were invited to think, not just obey. In Reich hospitals, a nurse was an extension of the medical authority. He did not question, he did not propose, he did not analyze. In the American structure, nurses were active clinical agents, capable of suggesting changes, recording observations, and making decisions within their competence. This autonomy, taught naturally, produced the first internal shock. The prisoners discovered that their profession could be more than discipline. It could be knowledge. The systematic documentation of the cases was another point of shock. Each patient had individual medical records with daily evolution, adverse reactions to medications, and observations by multiple professionals. There were nursing meetings, case discussions, protocol analysis. For someone who came from a system that recorded only the essentials, and always with a focus on military effectiveness, that level of rigor and care was disconcerting. And then came the most uncomfortable point: the rational use of antibiotics. The Germans had heard of penicillin but had never applied it. In the Nazi system, its production was insignificant, its distribution restricted, its use sporadic. In American hospitals, penicillin was administered with clockwise accuracy, in doses adjusted for weight and age, accompanied by systematic clinical control. In just 2 months, those prisoners saw lung infections healed within days, grenade wounds heal without amputations, rheumatic fevers stopped with almost immediate effectiveness. What for them was a miracle, for the Americans it was routine. And that destroyed more than ignorance. It destroyed conviction. American nursing, in addition to being technical, was human. He taught how to listen to the patient, to observe nonverbal signals, to prioritize comfort, to consider emotional factors in the clinical picture. None of this existed in the formation of the Reich, based on eugenics, hierarchy, and sacrifice. The American system, on the contrary, invested in the patient as an individual, and it offered nurses the tools to understand this complexity. It was in this environment that the prisoners began to get rid of their ideological armor, because it was no longer a question of military confrontation, but of professional identity. When they were treated as caregivers, even though they were enemies, They were forced to reformulate everything they knew about their craft. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them from the beginning. It was no secret. It was access. And if you're enjoying unraveling these facts and technical revelations that changed the course of medicine in the middle of the war, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed and historical content like this. Because what these nurses were about to discover in the coming days wasn't just a new technique. It was a new moral order. They would be supervised by those who, according to their background, should never be there. Because in the next ward, whoever was in charge of the ward, she was not white. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, the silence between metal beds and heart monitors was broken only by the steady sound of respirators and the clatter of stretcher wheels on polished linoleum. There in Infirmary P, a wing reserved exclusively for German prisoners of war, something unprecedented was happening. German nurses, trained in Third Reich academies to serve race and country, were now under the direct supervision of women who, according to the racial textbooks they had studied, were not even supposed to be in the field of science. African American women, many of whom graduated from schools such as Tuskegee Institute and Freedman's Hospital, operated the same sterilization equipment, controlled the same medical records, applied the same antibiotics, with precision, authority, and technical mastery. For the prisoners, there was no possible preparation for this. They had not only been brought up with prejudices, they had been molded from a young age to believe that knowledge, leadership, and competence were exclusive attributes of Aryan purity. Seeing themselves instructed by black women, corrected by them, was more than discomfort. It was implosion. Segregation in the U.S. Military, which relegated black nurses to less prestigious roles, had unwittingly created a historical paradox. It placed precisely these professionals to serve the same Nazi soldiers and nurses who considered them inferior. But what the segregationist system saw as a demotion, the Germans came to see as a revelation. The technique of these women was unquestionable. They followed strict protocols, conducted complex screenings, and guided the prisoners calmly and accurately. The discipline was silent, the gestures firm. They didn't scream. They did not impose themselves. They just knew, and they knew a lot. One of the Germans in later notes wrote, "They spoke little, but when they did, you had to listen." None of our instructors in Germany had that mastery of equipment. This moral clash was even more cruel because it took place in silence. None of the African American nurses needed to cite the contradiction. It was present in every procedure performed to perfection, in every clinical order given clearly, in every correction made with restrained authority. The myth of racial superiority was not challenged with speeches. It was dissolved by professional action. There were moments of tension. The Germans avoided eye contact. Some refused to accept instructions at first. But the disease does not respect ideology. When the septicemia advanced, when the fever did not subside, it was the black nurse who held the prisoner's arm, adjusted the IV valve, ordered the medication to be changed. She was the one who saved her, and nothing could erase that. The greatest discomfort, perhaps, was realizing that the hierarchy imposed by the countryside, which placed these black women in inferior positions in the eyes of American society, was still fairer and more effective than the logic of racial purity that sustained the Reich. There, the color of the skin did not prevent the technical authority. Segregation was real, but competence ignored barriers. And this, for those who lived medicine as an arm of ideology, was a slow and devastating poison. At the end of weeks of coexistence, the gestures changed. The initial refusal gave way to silent respect. The instructions began to be promptly followed. Ignorance has been replaced by observation, prejudice by learning. No ideological conversion is instantaneous. But there, in the halls of Camp Forest, in the face of the competence of women that the doctrine said were impossible, one of the most ingrained pillars of the Nazi system began to crumble. The unshakable belief that race alone defined value. One of the most cutting phrases came from a prisoner with a history of action on the Eastern Front. She muttered, as she saw a black nurse dexterously apply a catheter, "Nobody told us they could be better." The phrase was not just an acknowledgement. It was an epitaph, not for an individual belief but for an entire doctrine. And yet the collapse was far from over. Because if the racial clash overturned certainties, What would come next would destroy Nazi medicine at its foundation. Blood, not metaphorical but literal, typed, stored, transported, with an efficiency that the Reich would never achieve. The next impact would come in vials, and it would save lives in minutes. What started as technical curiosity quickly turned into a quiet obsession. For the captured German nurses, among gleaming scalpels and electrical panels, there was one object that aroused absolute fascination: translucent amber glass vials containing human blood plasma, arranged in refrigerated boxes labeled with millimeter precision, numbered by lot and date. They looked like they came out of a science fiction laboratory, but they were real and abundant. The American blood and plasma system operated as an industrial chain: mass collection in civilian banks, systematic typing, cross-compatibility, pasteurization, refrigeration, rail and air transportation, hospital distribution, and protocol-controlled administration. It was the engineering of healing. In Germany, blood transfusion was still an improvised, often direct, human-to-human procedure with no effective control of contamination. Plasma, due to its instability, was rarely used on a large scale. In contrast, the Americans treated blood as a logistical resource and invested in it with the same priority as a strategic weaponry. In 1943, the U.S. produced more than 500,000 liters of stored plasma, Germany less than 15,000. When DRK nurses began to observe plasma transfusions in soldiers with abdominal hemorrhages, open fractures, and multiple traumas, they witnessed something that, in their previous practice, was simply inconceivable: the reversal of hypovolemic shock in minutes. Where they awaited death, they saw pulses return, faces regain color, limbs avoid amputation. In their notebooks, they obsessively jotted down the codes of the vials, the drip rates, the times, the vital signs. Some copied the entire labels. The fetish was not just technical, it was existential. What had been considered impossible, storing life, now lay there, in geometric rows, stored as ammunition of hope. And more than that, it was administered without distinction. American soldiers, German prisoners, civilians wounded by bombing raids, they all received the same plasma. Blood, for Americans, had no ideology. There was typing, and this logic, mathematical and human at the same time, confronted the most ingrained dogma of Nazi medicine: blood as a racial identity. In front of the vials labeled with letters and numbers, the prisoners understood that what defined survival was not the purity of the blood, but its compatibility. An American Jewish soldier and an SS officer could, in theory, receive the same plasma. It was a scientific heresy and a moral humiliation. The efficiency of the system was astounding. At hospitals such as the 21st General in Ravenel, France, the stock was updated daily by telegraph. Each plasma unit had a traced route, clinical destination, and disposal protocol. The prisoners discovered that even the return of the empty vial was recorded. Nothing was left to chance. And it was in this environment that one of them wrote a phrase that would later become a symbol of this silent conversion: "The blood that saved us came without questions." The impact was so profound that, even without formal authorization, several prisoners began to teach each other the procedures they observed. Plasma had become not just a symbol of technological superiority, but of a system that treated life as a universal value. And as they jotted down formulas, flowcharts, and clandestine manuals, they began to wonder what they would do with that knowledge if they ever returned to Germany. Because for the first time, the enemy had not only won, he had shown a better way. But the scientific avalanche was far from over, because on the clinical horizon of 1944, a new word began to circulate in the hospital corridors: penicillin. A substance that alone would reduce amputations, stop chronic infections, and change the logic of war. And it didn't arrive in drops. It came in trillions of units. In 1944, in the makeshift barracks of Fort Robinson, Nebraska, German nurses sat for the first time in front of a blackboard where obedience was not taught, but reflection. Lieutenant Colonel James Kirk, a physician and educator in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, began the class with a phrase that would cut across ideology: "The good doctor is not the one who follows orders. It's what he knows why he does it." Silence. For women trained in a rigid hierarchical structure, where authority was infallible and questions were seen as a challenge, The idea of teaching based on doubts, hypotheses, and counter-arguments was as perplexing as the autoclaves they had seen weeks earlier. In the program called Special Projects Division, the Americans had designed an emergency curriculum. It wasn't just about teaching how to give penicillin, it was about teaching why it worked. Classes covered basic microbiology, population hygiene, disaster triage, burn treatment, and epidemic outbreaks. But they also, and this was the most revolutionary thing, they taught medical ethics, the history of science, and the rights of the patient. One of the modules was about illegitimate scientific experiments. Without naming names, the instructors described reprehensible practices carried out in times of war. The German nurses recognized in the descriptions what they had learned to consider advances in racial medicine. Now they heard that it was a crime, and they heard from doctors in clean coats with books in their hands, not with guns on their waists. The structure of American education was as different as the hospital equipment. There, the mistake was part of the process. Nurses could argue with instructors, disagree with protocols, suggest alternatives. In the Nazi system, this would be insubordination. In the American, it was clinical thinking. In the first month, more than 500 German prisoners went through technical workshops at Fort Robinson, including 78 nurses. In 3 months, there were already more than 1,000. A striking statistic: 87% of prisoners with medical training expressed, in internal reports, that American pedagogical methods surpassed German ones in clarity, timeliness, and practical application. Now, a fact that deserves to be highlighted. In 1945, the United States produced 6.8 trillion units of penicillin. Germany, none. That's right, 0. American medicine was industrial, strategic, and scientific. The German, though technically advanced in certain points, had been politicized to sterility. If this difference in production impresses you, comment now with shocking data or absolute power. We want to know how much this historical discrepancy surprised you. The impact of the teaching was so profound that the instructors themselves noticed a behavioral change. Nurses who previously sat stiff with their hands crossed in their laps began to raise their hands, to ask, to be discussed. Some began to correct colleagues. Others started side notes to apply in the future. A report by Captain Alan Branson, dated March 1945, describes, "These prisoners are not only learning American medicine, they are absorbing the ethos of medicine, to treat to cure, not to obey." The doctrine that once told them who was worth living now lost way to a manual that began with "all patients matter." The most symbolic? Many of these classes took place in English. The language of the enemy became the language of knowledge. Improvised dictionaries circulated between the beds. Some nurses, without formal access to translation, began to memorize technical terms only by repeated observation. The language of science overcame the barrier of propaganda, and it was just the beginning. Because if learning from the enemy was already a collapse for ideology, teaching colleagues when returning to the ruined homeland would be an even more radical act. And this return was already being prepared, with manuals, certificates, and protocols. The prison camp was no longer a captivity. It became an incubator. What was born there was not just knowledge. It was the future reconstruction of German medicine. But before that, one last test awaited the nurses, confronting the images that the world had just seen. Because between vials of penicillin and nursing protocols, the truth emerged that no class could soften: the concentration camps. On Christmas Eve 1943, the Alva, Oklahoma prison camp looked like a geopolitical anomaly. As Europe burned in frozen trenches and ruined cities, a group of German prisoners of war, among them dozens of Red Cross nurses, received packages wrapped in colored paper, with red ribbons and cards signed by childlike hands. American Boy Scouts, accompanied by Red Cross volunteers, had walked through the camp gates with boxes marked with the symbol of gift and contradiction: the lasso. Inside the packages there were items that until then had seemed inaccessible in times of war: chocolate, scented soap, ground coffee, clean socks, stationery, pencils, and cigarettes. They were not accompanied by insults or demands for surrender or ideological preaching. They were just gifts. At 8 p.m. in the makeshift cafeteria of the camp's medical sector, an American nurse lit the record player with an unusual record: Christmas carols in German. Stille Nacht, echoed between tables covered by white tablecloths. The prisoners, trained in a system that associated the enemy with moral decay, heard American voices singing in their language, not to mock, but to welcome. That night, there was no discussion of racial or technical superiority. There was silence, a silence full of shame, memory, and something deeper, doubt. How to reconcile the image of the brutal enemy with the Christian gesture of a shared banquet. Dinner was prepared with ingredients that, for most of them, were pre-war luxuries: roast turkey, ham, fresh vegetables, apple pie, and, what surprised them most, beer. The accounts in the diaries recovered after the war are almost unanimous. We cried because we did not understand how this was possible. That emotion was new. They had been trained to resist pain, not gentleness. The effect was devastating. In Nazi ideology, kindness should only be granted to those deemed worthy according to racial criteria. Seeing themselves as the recipient of compassion, offered free of charge by a supposed inferior enemy, destructured the entire logical basis of the system they had sworn to serve. One of the nurses, Ilsa K., recorded in her notebook, "We expected punishment. We have been given dignity." Christmas 1943 worked like a silent coup. There was no political speech, no pamphlet, no interrogation. There was only humanity. And it spoke louder than any propaganda. American officials understood, or perhaps intuited, the symbolic power of that moment. The following week, they sent copies of the Geneva Declaration, translated into German, to each tent in the camp, not as a threat, but as a demonstration of principle. Alongside the doctrine of care, the ritual of welcoming was now added, and that left marks. Far beyond the machines and statistics, it was this Christmas that many prisoners reported as the beginning of the breaking of the armor, a gesture that, because it was not mandatory, dismantled the logic of hatred. If the enemy offered a plate of hot food and sang his songs, what was left of the narrative of barbarism? If the system you learned to despise treated you more humanely than the very regime you served, where was civilization anyway? The Americans understood that winning the war was not just a matter of tanks. It was also a matter of testimony. Each nurse who cried over the turkey plate that night was a future transmitter of a truth that could not be contradicted by any Nazi pamphlet. And the psychological impact didn't end at the dinner table. It stretched out in the letters they received, in the choirs they heard, in the hands they shook. An act of kindness, when unexpected, has the power to humiliate more than a revolver. Because it forces the question, if they're so human, why do we believe they weren't? But what those women didn't know yet is that the biggest ideological shakeup was yet to come. And it wouldn't come with songs or desserts. It would come with images. Because a few months later, the first records of the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps would be exhibited, and the nurses would be forced to face not only the technical failure of the regime they served, but its moral monstrosity. While in German field hospitals each vial of morphine was counted as liquid gold, each bandage was boiled and reused until it disintegrated into fiber, and each meal was measured as if it fed an entire fortress. What the prisoner nurses witnessed in the American medical ward seemed like logistical heresy. Surgical instruments were changed after a single use. Bandages, sterile and still clean, were discarded naturally. Antibiotics that were close to expiration were simply taken off the shelves and incinerated. And full meals, untouched, went from the cafeteria to the garbage without any ceremony. At first glance, the behavior bordered on the absurd. For those women, trained under the dogma of permanent scarcity, it was almost sabotage. But within days, the logic behind the planned waste revealed itself. It was not a matter of disorganization. It was a brutal symbol of logistical supremacy. The United States could waste it because it could produce non-stop. One industrial chain fed another. From the assembly line to the front line, everything was round, continuous, guaranteed. Germany, as efficient as it was, struggled with every ton of coal and every truck of cotton. The Americans, on the other hand, operated with such a wide margin that the risk of failure was easily absorbed. This pattern was repeated in the small gestures: a disposable scalpel here, a pair of gloves there, syringes and ampules that were not even used, but were replaced daily. For the German nurses, this was not just a shock, it was a technical humiliation. American abundance proved to be not only functional, but ideological. She shouted a silent message: "We have so much we can throw away." One of the prisoners, in a letter intercepted and archived by the U.S. military wrote, "They produce what we need and throw away what we never had." The phrase became an internal joke among officers, but it also became the object of analysis for strategists. The enemy began to internalize its inferiority, not because of the weapons but because of the mess hall. The war for the Americans was also won in the logistics of garbage, and that, to a mind trained in the logic of absolute efficiency, was devastating. What was once a laughingstock in propaganda pamphlets, the materialistic decadence of Americans, was transformed into a monument to ability. It was no longer possible to deny. What the Germans called useless excess was, in practice, a strategic shield. The throwaway war was not wasteful. It was planning with plenty of it. It was operational security. It was a message. And like everything in the USA at that time, disposal was also systematized. Hospitals received periodic guidance to eliminate expired risk materials, even if they were still usable, not out of preciousness, but to maintain the standard. American industry was so nimble that it restocked before it was even needed. It was a culture of anticipation. Where Germany reacted, the United States prevented. For every unit of penicillin that Germany was considering synthesizing, the U.S. had already produced 1,000. For every bottle of plasma that the nurses carried around in fear of loss, the Americans stored hundreds in climate-controlled warehouses. And as if that weren't enough, there was also the most disturbing symbolic image of all, the supply incinerators. German nurses watched in disbelief as materials were destroyed because they no longer met the standard, not because they were useless. Every flame in that oven was like a joke against German rationality, a cruel reminder that for the United States winning the war did not require improvisation, only scale, and that was the abyss. The prisoners not only saw the abundance, but also the method, inventory control, the frequency of inspections, automatic replenishment. The chaos of war seemed non-existent behind the curtains of the American administration. An American doctor explained, matter-of-factly, that the hospital they were in received more morphine per week than a German civilian hospital in a year. And he did it without arrogance, just with the certainty of numbers. American industrial production by then had taken the form of a silent weapon. While Germany manufactured its Tigre tanks with an artisanal obsession and a shortage of parts, the United States preferred standardization, mass production, volume. Perfection in the American case was not an ideal. It was a statistic. And the historical irony stood out. The regime that had invested heavily in science applied to destruction now saw the science of preservation being used as an instrument of power. While the Germans counted pills, the Americans programmed containers. If the difference between nations were in a symbol, it would be that of a syringe. One, boiled by hand to be reused, the other, discarded after the first use. And for the nurses, each object had its political weight. The war they were waging, after all, was no longer against an enemy army. It was against evidence, against what his eyes could no longer deny, against a system that, without shooting, beat them day after day, bottle after bottle, procedure after procedure. Because where they saw remains, Americans saw security, and where they saw waste, there was in fact power. But the biggest impact was not yet in numbers or practices. It was in the images that would soon be projected to them in controlled viewing sessions, images coming from the camps that the regime itself had created. And in these projections, blood would cease to be a symbol of healing. It would become a memory of guilt. In the final months of 1944, as the front neared the total ruin of the Reich, something unlikely flourished behind the scenes of the war. Schools. Not ordinary schools, but pedagogical structures set up inside prison camps aimed exclusively at training captured health professionals. For Americans, this was more than a gesture of goodwill. It was a long-term strategy. Today's enemy would be tomorrow's citizen, and to rebuild Germany it would be necessary to rebuild their consciences, starting with the most sensitive base, medicine. In the medical department of the camp at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, German prisoner nurses began to attend formal courses, with a structured curriculum, uniformed teachers, and in many cases, written tests. The programs, supervised by the United States Army Medical Department, had a non-negotiable characteristic. It was not enough to know how to do it. It was necessary to understand why it was done. Anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, infectious diseases and epidemiology, were mixed with classes on bioethics, history of medicine, international protocols, and even debates on clinical dilemmas. For women who had been trained to perform without thinking, it was a cognitive earthquake. American pedagogy did not accept passivity. The Socratic method, based on questions, hypotheses, and reasoning, replaced the authoritarian manuals of Nazi nursing. A lesson did not end with an order, but with a question. What if it were you in the patient's place? This forced the prisoners to do something they had never experienced. Systematized empathy. The class did not end with the scalpel. It began with the reason for the incision. And there, between vein maps and antibiotic tables, the nurses began to realize what it really meant to care. In one of the courses offered, called Medicine in Times of Peace, a series of case studies simulated non-military situations: childbirth, urban diseases, civil accidents. The prisoners, for the first time, saw medicine not as an extension of war, but as an end in itself, an instrument for preserving, not selecting. One of the highlights of these courses was the contact with protocols of international organizations, such as the original Red Cross in Geneva and the Pan-American Health Organization. Books and documents were translated into German, and entire classes were devoted to the comparative analysis of American practices and international medical standards. The nurses discovered that much of what they had learned under the Nazi regime was not only technically outdated, but ethically unacceptable. The contrast was brutal. In Germany, they treated the wounded on the basis of their military function and racial utility. In the American camps, they learned that the medical oath was valid for everyone, including the enemy. And it was in this new environment that something even more unlikely happened. The first certificates. Nurses who successfully completed the courses received diplomas signed by U.S. medical officers, with validity recognized by international organizations. It was not a mere symbolic gesture. It was a seal. These women, trained in war, were being reprogrammed for reconstruction. Some of these prisoners, upon returning to Germany between 1946 and 1948, would become founders of nursing schools based on the American model. They implemented patient-centered methodologies, hospital safety protocols, and, most importantly, a culture of ethical questioning. The seeds sown in the soil of captivity would flourish decades later as pillars of humanized medicine in the post-war period. The American strategy was clear. More than defeating the enemy, it was necessary to convert him, not by force, but by reason. And this was only possible with education. While Germany burned its archives and hid its crimes, the U.S. printed handouts, projected slides, and taught women to think with scalpels in their hands and conscience in their eyes. And it was precisely this awareness that, little by little, began to break the silence. Prisoners' diaries began to report not only technical admiration, but moral shame. The most repeated phrase in the final evaluations of the courses was, "I wish I had learned this earlier." But it was too late to stop the past. It remained to learn from him. By the end of 1945, more than 2,700 German health professionals had undergone some form of medical instruction under American tutelage, and not by imposition, but out of conviction. The records indicate that most asked to continue studying even after the end of the course. They wanted more. They wanted to understand what they had not been allowed to understand. And it is precisely here that America's power showed itself in its most subtle form, not in the number of planes, tanks, or hospitals, but in its ability to teach the enemy to doubt what it believed. Because in the end, winning the war with bombs was easy. It was difficult to rebuild the world with books. And the most difficult chapter of this reconstruction was still missing. The moment when the images of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen would be projected before the eyes of those women, no longer as propaganda, but as true. And no class would prepare their consciences for what they would see. For many of the Reich prisoner nurses, medicine had been emptied of soul. It was a militarized functional job, subordinated to the biological destiny assigned to each individual by the regime. The patient was worth what his race, his rank, his usefulness was worth. Saving an Aryan soldier was a mission. Saving a Soviet prisoner of war, an unnecessary risk. But in 1945, in the American hospitals where they were held, that logic began to crumble, not because of speeches, but because of scenes. One of them recounted years later the moment when she saw an American doctor kneeling before a wounded Japanese patient, wiping his feet with a towel soaked in warm water. The gesture, for her, made no sense. Why take care of an enemy with such tenderness? The answer did not come in words. It came in repeated codes: dignity, ethics, humanity. American medicine operated on a moral basis that made no distinction between friend and foe, between victor and vanquished. The pain, when it appeared, was enough, and this reactivated in the nurses values that had been buried by the doctrine: compassion, mercy, charity. In the Nazi system, these terms had been replaced by others: efficiency, purity, submission. Now, in an environment where every life was treated with equal attention, where even the enemy was welcomed, the very meaning of the profession began to change. One of the most symbolic moments of this spiritual upheaval took place at the Fort Riley prison camp. During an interfaith ceremony on Sunday, German nurses were invited to attend, alongside American nurses and prisoners of various nationalities, a mass conducted by a Methodist military chaplain. The sermon that day spoke of the Good Samaritan, an old story but with immediate application. The chaplain said, "True faith does not ask whom you serve. Ask if there is pain before you." The silence among the prisoners was almost absolute. The medicine they knew had taught otherwise, and it was at this point that the spiritual impact began to consolidate. When care was no longer just technical and became sacred, when touch ceased to be a function and became a testimony. American science, while firmly based on evidence, did not exclude human values. On the contrary, it incorporated them. Doctors talked about microbiology and ethics. Nurses discussed asepsis techniques and patient rights. There was no contradiction between precision and mercy. There was symbiosis. One of the prisoners, in her diary, noted, "They heal with light, but also with eyes that look." And it was not an exaggeration. The look, the tone of voice, the continuous presence, everything was part of the treatment. And this shook not only the medical logic of the nurses, but their existential convictions. For many, medicine had been the instrument by which they had served a totalitarian state. Now it emerged as a bridge to a greater truth, that human life did not need to deserve to be saved. It was enough to exist. A curious fact that illustrates the scope of this transformation. Between 1943 and 1945, at least 1,200 prisoners of war, including German nurses, doctors, and auxiliaries, voluntarily requested access to religious literature in the American camps, an increase of more than 600% compared to the first year of captivity. The question was no longer just technical, it was spiritual. Why take care of those who don't deserve it? And the answer was always the same: because it deserves to exist. Now, a fact that many underestimate. In 1945, the United States maintained more than 750 military hospitals in active operation, with the capacity to treat 1.6 million patients a year. A system capable of absorbing the Pacific and European fronts as well as prisoners of war, all treated according to the same protocol. No nation in history had structured such a vast, uniform, and humanized medical apparatus during a conflict on a global scale. If this statistic surprised you, comment now with unbelievable or absolute power. The impact of this system was not just logistical, it was moral. What happened in the corridors of these hospitals was not just the healing of bodies, it was a healing of consciences. The faith stifled by years of militarism and propaganda found resonance not in hymns, but in practices, not in books, but in beds. Medicine, when impregnated with compassion, became the most powerful argument against the logic of exclusion. And this argument, silent and precise, began to generate what no tank, plane, or bomb could: regret. A nurse reported during interrogation at Fort Meade, "I never thought mercy could have a method, but here she does." And the method was working, because the next step would not be technical nor spiritual. It would be visual. The screens would be assembled, the projectors lit, and the images that would follow would not have anesthesia. Nurse Anneliese Hartmann had been trained since the age of 17 at the Institute for Racial Hygiene in Berlin. There, she had learned that the role of a health worker was not to save everyone, but to preserve the genetically valuable. She and her colleagues absorbed this doctrine as if it were science. In American medical fields, this conviction has not only met with opposition, it has met with contrary evidence. a Polish prisoner with typhus, a Japanese soldier mutilated by grenades, a malnourished Italian civilian. All received equal treatment to an American officer. The medical records made no distinction of ethnicity. Medicines were distributed by clinical priority, not by nationality. A field hospital in Livorno even recorded in a single month in 1944, 512 blood transfusions for Axis prisoners, using the same plasma bank reserved for Allied troops. This was no exception. It was politics. The American military health system operated on a simple principle. If it bleeds, it deserves care. And this principle hit the German prisoners at their most sensitive point, the belief that they belonged to a higher caste. Racial dogma was unraveled not under direct attack, but under the repetition of unthinkable gestures. Jewish doctors treating Wehrmacht soldiers, black nurses leading shifts, American officers exchanging smiles with wounded German civilians, an inverted world where biological hierarchy gave way to hospital equality. And the most disturbing thing, it worked. The patients survived. The wounds closed. The pain ceased. The doctrine collapsed before the efficacy of compassion. At Camp Polk Military Hospital, Nurse Erica Weiss was assigned to assist in a recovery ward that housed, side by side, wounded American soldiers, Italian civilians rescued from bombing, and German prisoners. She hesitated. A doctor reassured her. Here, no one is an enemy. It's just organisms trying to survive. The term, scientific and devoid of rhetoric, had philosophical weight. Life, reduced to its rawest base, deserved respect. This logic clashed directly with the ethnic screening medicine taught in Germany, where a patient's fate was plotted before they were even examined. In the United States, the diagnosis came later, always after. The protocol was clear: vital signs, tests, treatment, without asking origin, without consulting family tree. It was medicine without a flag, and that was disconcerting. The racial paradigm was also beginning to crumble in language. German nurses began to adopt terms such as critical patient, medical priority, medical history, instead of subhuman, enemy, inferior race. The vocabulary changed, and with it, the perception. The dehumanization that sustained the regime was linguistic, and when it was dismantled, it dragged with it the moral foundations of the Third Reich. The impact of this reversal was visible. Records show that among prisoners who spent more than 6 months in American custody, about 70% changed their opinion of Nazi medicine, classifying it as partial or instrumentalized. Some even declared in the repatriation questionnaires that they intended to abandon their medical careers because they no longer trusted what they had learned. Others, on the contrary, decided to start over and study again from scratch under the new principles. A symbolic moment occurred in February 1945, in a camp in Virginia, when an American nurse handed a cup of hot tea to a German prisoner with the flu. Nothing much, except for the fact that the nurse was black. The prisoner, years earlier, had participated in training that preached the sterilization of Afro-descendants. Now she received relief from the hands of a woman whom her ideology considered inferior. The scene did not end with tears. It ended with silence. A silence of moral disorientation. American medicine showed in practice that efficacy was not the monopoly of one race, but of a system based on data, protocols, and above all, humanity. It was a medicine that didn't ask who you were, it asked what you felt. The shock of this logic was overwhelming. Germany had invested fortunes in genetic research, but had failed to build a hospital network capable of absorbing the impact of the war. The United States, by contrast, created a system so robust that it was able to deal with the enemy without compromising its own army. This was more than technique. It was moral power. Now, a statistic that defines this abyss. In 1944, the U.S. Army used more than 2,300 different types of drugs in its field hospitals. Germany, under lockdown and industrial collapse, operated with less than 400 active pharmaceutical compounds. If this difference impressed you, comment now with logistics wins or shocking data. This technical distance was also a philosophical distance, because where German medicine selected, American medicine welcomed. Where one eliminated, the other restored. Where one judged, the other cared. It was the collapse not only of a regime, but of an idea, And it is just when these ideas began to dissolve that the projectors were turned on. For the first time, those nurses would see images not of a surgical field, but of an extermination camp. Army cameras would reveal not only dead bodies, but decisions, medical decisions, and some of them, they knew, had been taken by hands similar to theirs. In early April 1945, projectors were mounted in the pavilions of the prison camps. All around, rows of metal chairs, columns of nurses sitting in military silence. The atmosphere was not one of lecture, nor of class. It was something new, undefined, and dense. An American official, with a restrained tone, only announced, "These images were recorded by our troops as they liberated the Nazi concentration camps. You have the right to see what your leaders have done in the name of science and the homeland." The lights went out, and the silence was broken not by words but by frames. The canvas revealed bodies piled up in Dachau, living skeletons in Bergen-Belsen, mutilated children in Auschwitz. But what impressed me most were not the corpses. It was the lab coats, Nazi doctors next to surgical instruments, nurses smiling as they organized medical records. The German prisoners saw themselves, not in the dead, but in the living, in those they executed, in those they omitted. The ideological collapse had already been underway for months, but there, he became irrefutable. A nurse named Clara, upon seeing the images of a hypothermia experiment conducted in Ravensbrück, covered her eyes and muttered, "I used this protocol. I just didn't know what it was for." Another, seeing the H mark drawn in pencil on the thigh of a Jewish prisoner, understood what it meant. H for Herz, heart, indicating that the organ would be removed while still alive, for study. It was no longer possible to deny it. It was no longer possible to protect oneself behind the argument of ignorance. The images were technical. They needed to be interpreted by those who knew the trade. And those women knew. They knew how to read clinical tables. They knew how to interpret vital signs. They knew that what they saw was not assembly. It was method. The horror was not impulsive. It was planned. The medicine he was supposed to save had been set up to kill, and many of those who pulled the trigger used stethoscopes. In the days following the screening, the interrogations changed tone. It was no longer a matter of gathering information, but of observing reactions. Some nurses denied it. They said it was American propaganda. Others, in smaller numbers, remained silent. They did not say a word, but some have begun to speak out. One of them, named Ruth, confessed to having worked in a military hospital in Breslau, where Polish prisoners disappeared after experimental consultations. He said he had never asked questions. Now I wanted to know. I wanted names, dates, reports. For the first time, the instinct was not to obey. It was to understand. The impact of the visual evidence was devastating because it did not appeal to emotion. He appealed to technical knowledge. A scalpel on an operating table said more to these women than 1,000 speeches. They knew the weight of a protocol, the time of an incision, the meaning of a syringe already filled. They knew that none of this was an accident. It was a system. And the system had been supported by professionals like them. The fault was not generic. It was functional. And this guilt was documented. U.S. Army reports, produced weeks after the sessions, reveal that more than 60% of female medical prisoners who watched the films requested one-on-one meetings with chaplains, psychologists, or interpreters. Many cried. Some vomited. Others asked to review the images. Not to punish himself, but to sue. There was a gulf between what they had learned and what they now knew. What they called national honor was shown to be a structural complicity. A little-known fact. Among the doctors and nurses who attended the Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen records, at least 94 began to voluntarily collaborate with Allied investigations. Many provided lists of names, sorting locations, technical terms used in the German reports. It was a form of reparation, or of relief, or of despair. But it was also a new type of resistance, no longer armed but documentary. The medicine that had been an accomplice became a witness. The United States quickly understood the strategic value of these conversions. Repentant doctors became key players in gathering evidence for the Nuremberg trials. His testimonies, written in clinical terminology, allowed him to translate horror into scientific language. And this translation was essential, because mass death needed to be explained by those who understood protocols, temperature scales, lethal dosages. Science that had been perverted now helped to reconstruct the truth. The most ironic thing is that the American machine, so criticized for its industrial coldness, was precisely the one that managed to humanize the enemy and disarm ideology through medicine, not with bullets, but with light. And this light, projected on the screen of a prison camp, freed more than a consciousness. It freed the concept of healing. And if until now the war seemed to be won by scalpels and plasma, the next revelation would show that the American victory was not only in the hospitals, he was on the ships. Because the United States built a floating system of life, naval hospitals, that would redefine the concept of medical care in war, and that the German nurses, when they saw it on the horizon, mistook it for cities. In March 1945, with Germany's military collapse already evident and the shadow of surrender hanging over Europe, the United States began one of the quietest and most visionary operations of the post-war era, the retraining of prisoner medical professionals, with a focus on the future needs of devastated Germany. Field hospitals and detention camps have quietly become emergency training centers, but not for combat, for reconstruction. German nurses who had entered captivity as cogs in a totalitarian system were shaped as cogs in a new Germany, where public health would replace eugenics and collective care would take precedence over racial screening. The doctrine was replaced by data, belief, by method. American officials, in partnership with humanitarian organizations and universities, structured intensive curricula that taught everything from basic sanitation fundamentals to practical epidemiology, hospital management in destroyed regions, vaccination campaigns, and response to outbreaks of typhus and dysentery, diseases that they knew would explode in the months following the end of the war. These programs did not have a tone of punishment, but of urgency. It was a race against time. Germany, on the verge of surrender, lacked functional sanitary infrastructure in dozens of cities. The Reich had collapsed its drug distribution network, destroyed civilian research centers, and trained nurses more to obey than to lead. It was necessary to plant in the soil of the defeated enemy the seeds of a democratic, scientific, preventive medicine. The prisoners were not forced to participate, but almost all of them accepted, some with suspicion, others with hope, many guilty. Dresden-trained nurse Helga Dietrich wrote in her diary that the first public health class taught by an American major had been more useful than 4 years of blind obedience. The class dealt with vector control, something that the Germans knew, but did not apply en masse due to lack of resources and doctrinal rigidity. The instructor showed how community hygiene campaigns, soap distribution, and simple lectures could contain epidemics before they emerged. For Helga, it was more than practice. It was philosophy. Medicine ceased to be a response to disease and became a shield against collapse. The most shocking, however, was the reach. In hospitals and fields from Alabama to Virginia, nurses received instruction in a variety of areas that went beyond classical nursing, managing pharmaceutical stocks, creating epidemiological bulletins, screening for severity, monitoring infant mortality. All of this sounded not only modern, it sounded feasible, executable, scientifically controllable. It was the opposite of the ideological medicine they had served. And then came the mass vaccination module. Nazi Germany did not prioritize popular immunizations, seeing them as a high cost for populations considered weak. The U.S., on the other hand, invested in vaccines as a strategic weapon. During the war, more than 80 million doses of typhus, tetanus, and yellow fever vaccine were produced. German nurses learned how to store, administer, and most importantly, how to record and monitor immunization campaigns, a first for many of them. This part of the training not only taught a new technique, it taught a new vision of society. A country that vaccinates the poor and prisoners believes that everyone must survive. This idea, universal, silent, and radical, provoked more than admiration. It caused transformation. Meanwhile, in parallel, another pillar of reconstruction was erected: the fight against malnutrition. Nurses learned about dietary supplementation, preparing diets for underserved populations, emergency use of liquid calories, and nutritional pastes, such as K-ration adapted for civilians. These protocols had been tested by the Americans in disaster zones and were now passed on to the future cadres of the new Germany. The plan was clear. The women who had once served the regime that let civilians die for famine would now learn to save them with powdered milk, fortified starch, and communal bread fermentation. And they didn't just learn, they practiced. In simulations set up in the camps, they distributed meals, set up mobile kitchens, organized queues as they would in war-torn villages. The irony of this story is that the reconstruction of Germany began before the surrender, and it began within the captivity. If you're enjoying unraveling these hidden layers of history, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to reveal how, even among ruins, scientific logic and logistical planning can redraw the destiny of a nation. Because what the war manuals did not foresee was that between syringes and maps, a new mission would sprout, to rebuild, so as not to repeat. And it was in this spirit that a new proposal emerged. The trained nurses would begin to be sent back to Germany, not as prisoners but as carriers of a new model. And before boarding, they would receive the last gift from the Americans, a uniform, but not military, a white apron marked with an unexpected inscription in English. You are now a guardian of life, not ideology. They disembarked discreetly. No medals, no honors, no flags. In 1946, dozens of former prisoner nurses began returning to Germany, now occupied and fragmented, walking among ruins with a new kind of mission. Rebuilding, but not with bricks, with scalpels, protocols, and memory. What they had absorbed in the American camps was not just technique, it was a model of thought. And this model began to infiltrate the fabric of German medicine like an undercurrent, silent but transformative. In cities such as Hanover, Leipzig, and Essen, nursing schools were reopened or founded with the help of international organizations, and among the names who volunteered to teach were those women who had known in practice the medical abundance of the Allies. They didn't talk about revenge. They talked about asepsis, blood typing, vaccination campaign, standardized medical records, sterilization of instruments. The vocabulary had changed, and with it, culture. The transformation began with small gestures. A hospital in Cologne abolished the rigid hierarchical system between doctors and nurses after one of them, a former prisoner from Arkansas, showed how delegating responsibilities had saved lives in the camp. Another in Dresden instituted the systematic use of filter paper and autoclaves, following the recommendation of a technique that had been trained by African Americans at Fort Huachuca. Reports show that some of these professionals were still hesitant to speak publicly about what they experienced. But what they learned did not need a discourse. It was visible in the corridors, in the spreadsheets, in the new rituals of asepsis and care. German medicine, previously hijacked by a racial doctrine, was beginning to relearn how to serve human beings. In 1947, a report by the International Red Cross highlighted that medical facilities in Western Germany were increasingly adopting scientific and humanitarian standards consistent with those observed in the United States and the United Kingdom. The document named without names requalified former prisoners as part of the essential workforce in this transition. It was not a question of ideological conversions, but of technical convictions. Saving was more efficient than selecting. Sterilizing was cheaper than amputating. Educating was more effective than punishing. The logic that these women had witnessed in their years of captivity was beginning to prove functional on German soil, and more than that, it began to gain scale. Some of the former nurses went on to coordinate regional nursing courses, teaching what they had learned from American textbooks, color screening techniques, isolation protocols for infectious diseases, recording vital signs in standardized medical records, preventive use of antibiotics. Others collaborated with UNICEF and World Health Organization projects, working on vaccination and child nutrition campaigns. It was as if, instead of returning defeated, they had returned reconverted, carrying a knowledge that even coming from the enemy now served life. The doctrine had lost. Science defeated. The most curious thing is that these changes did not come from decrees but from behavior. Techniques that once seemed too American began to become commonplace simply because they worked. German hospitals, destroyed by bombings and emptied of resources, have found in these new protocols a way to regain efficiency with less. The American industrial logic, so criticized for its impersonality, revealed its greatest strength. It was replicable. Allied medicine could be copied, and it was being. a former Nazi doctor, interrogated in 1948, admitted, "They won because they knew how to treat an infection before they knew who the patient was." This sentence reveals more than a confession. It reveals a moral surrender. Nazi racial medicine, based on purity and exclusion, not only failed ethically, it failed technically. It was defeated by a medicine that treated before judging, that cured before classifying, that saved before asking for nationality. And those who carried this victory into the new Germany were precisely those who years before believed they were on the right side of history. When they returned, they no longer spoke of superiority. They talked about prevention. The transformation was so profound that in 1952, the government of the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany instituted a new national curriculum for nursing schools, based in part on guidelines drawn up by American medical missions between 1945 and 1948. And although the official documents did not mention names, behind the scenes it was known. Many of the contributions came from former prisoners who now held consulting and teaching positions. Some wrote manuals, others wrote articles. Many never spoke publicly about the past again, but they all left their mark. One of them, Nurse Ingrid Vollmer, was invited to head a new medical training center in Stuttgart. In his inaugural address, he said only one sentence: "Medicine has set me free twice, when I healed and when I learned." For her, as for so many others, captivity was not prison. It was re-education. It was not the end. It was origin. And that is why, decades later, when visiting modern hospitals in Germany, one can perceive an almost imperceptible but loaded detail, not by submission, but by origin. A reminder that, in the midst of the rubble, it was the technical language of the enemy that once again taught the universal value of life. But the story is not over yet, because, while nurses rebuilt hospitals and consciences, the world judged the crimes that had stained medicine forever. And at Nuremberg, stethoscopes became proof. Medicine was judged. And for the first time in history, doctors sat in the dock. The words they could not say out loud, they wrote in the shadow of dawn, in worn-out notebooks. Loose pages and edges trembled by hands that once wielded thermometers as soldiers wield rifles. Between 1946 and 1955, hundreds of letters, diaries, and reports written by German nurses who had been prisoners of war began to circulate discreetly among universities, family archives, and medical societies. They were not memories of heroism. They were confessions, raw accounts, sometimes technical, sometimes poetic, about the internal collapse they experienced. We learned to measure fever, but we never measured the fever of the ideology that surrounded us, one wrote, in a letter addressed to a cellmate in Virginia. In another excerpt, dated January 1948, a former nurse on the Eastern Front notes, "We have been trained to spare the strong and ignore the weak. They, our captors, treated our fevers with ice, our wounds with penicillin, and our silences with respect." Memories reveal something deeper than shock. They reveal moral reconstruction. One of the most impressive collections was found in Munich, in the archives of the German Red Cross, a 160-page notebook without a cover, signed only as E. The author describes in technical and emotional detail her process of ideological deconstruction. She recounts the moment she saw an African-American soldier administering morphine to a German prisoner of war, and how it paralyzed her, not out of fear, but out of shame, because he did what I would have refused to do. The notebook became a reference in post-war studies on moral re-education, and it is just one of dozens. In Frankfurt, a university maintained for years a project of silent reading of these texts by medical students. The objective was clear: to show that medicine is not neutral. It is an ethical battleground. Some letters contain explicit contradictions. In one of them, Nurse Margaret W., who worked in occupied Ukraine, writes, "What have I been taught? That the German people were the people of science, but what did I see? That they were the ones who were aware. That while we used blind scalpels, they used light. While we administered vinegar, they used penicillin." And then, a sentence that sums up the internal conflict of an entire generation of Nazi health professionals. "We were caregivers of a regime of death, and we were cared for by a system of life." This phrase, preserved in her personal diary, was cited by historians as a synthesis of the turn of consciousness that affected thousands of former prisoners. But it wasn't just emotions. These accounts document medical practices with near-surgical precision. There are descriptions of American protocols to combat septicemia, reports on hospital infection control, notes on the logic of safe disposal of materials, comments on the organizational structure of night shifts in Allied field hospitals. These nurses recorded, as if they knew, that what they had experienced needed to be preserved, not as evidence of defeat, but as a testimony of reconstruction. They knew that one day someone would read it, and maybe understand. In 1951, a small book was published in Zurich, signed under a pseudonym by a former prisoner, In the Fields of Light, What I Learned from the Enemy. The title at the time went unnoticed, but decades later, he would become a reference in bioethics courses. The author recounted the feeling of seeing an American mobile hospital functioning for the first time, how tents were set up, how the flow of patients was triaged, how electric light created surgical clarity where there was once darkness. I came from a Reich that preached purity, but it was in the hands of the impure that I found true science, he wrote. In archives rescued in the late 1990s, voice recordings of some of these nurses were found, made in private interviews for historical research centers. Most never wanted the audios to be released in life. In them, it is possible to hear the hesitation between sentences, the silence between answers. One of them cries as she describes the moment she first administered a diphtheria vaccine to a Roma child under American supervision. That was wrong, I was told a lifetime, but nothing seemed so right to me. These memories, neglected for decades, became interpretive keys to a larger phenomenon. The American victory was not only warlike, it was technical, and it was moral. The decisive battlefield wasn't Omaha or the Ardennes, it was the hospital. It was the moment when a nurse, indoctrinated by an ideology of extermination, applied a clean bandage in silence to the arm of an enemy. There, in that gesture, the Third Reich began to crumble. But what is impressive is that these voices have almost been lost. During the Cold War, the reports were shelved. During the economic reconstruction, forgotten. And only recently have they begun to emerge as essential historical documents for understanding the non-military impact of war. It was not the tanks nor the bombings that changed those women. It was the syringes, the medical records, the human gestures, and the abundance. The legacy of those words still echoes. In German universities, some excerpts are read aloud at nursing graduation ceremonies. In memory museums, such as the one in Berlin, specific sections were created on the ethical transformation of the medical profession in the post-war period. And it all started with yellowed pages, hidden in cardboard boxes written by those who once served the regime, but chose to serve life. And now, when we think about judgment, reparation, justice, a new stage rises. Because, while these memories came to life in the hands of history, other lives, who could not write anything, asked for a voice. And it was then that, in Nuremberg, for the first time, medicine was called to the dock. The Allies' deepest victory was not celebrated with military parades or recorded in peace treaties. It took place in silence, inside surgical tents, makeshift classrooms, and hospital wings where flags no longer mattered. War had taught that tanks open paths, but it is medicine that builds bridges. And it was on these bridges that an army of former enemies walked, transformed, not by coercion, but by compassion. What the Reich strategists did not foresee, what no military doctrine dared to imagine, is that one day their nurses would be cured by what they despised most: empathy. In the American camps, they received more than meals and vaccines. They were allowed to relearn. And they learned. They watched doctors save Russian soldiers with the same zeal with which they treated Allied generals. They saw protocols being patiently explained to those who barely spoke English. And they witnessed black women, who in their doctrine should be subordinate, coordinate entire wings with scientific precision and calm authority. American medicine didn't just cure. She taught that everyone had the right to be healed. The most powerful gesture of this war was not a shot. It was a bandage. When an American doctor knelt before a German prisoner wounded by shrapnel and asked permission to touch her leg before applying morphine, something broke, not in the bone, but in ideology. Because there was no humiliation there. There was care. The Reich did not teach this. He taught that weakness was disposable, that the sick was a burden, that the enemy did not deserve help, But the Americans operated with another manual, one where the value of a life was not defined by race, function, or flag, but by its simple existence. This logic, so simple and so revolutionary, has broken down more walls than any bombing. And this medicine, far from being neutral, was a political tool, but not of domination, of reconciliation. Each vial of penicillin applied to a former enemy was a message. Each anatomy class given to prisoners, a manifesto. Every emergency operation carried out on surrendered soldiers, an unwritten peace treaty. Science there was not just technical, it was diplomacy. And the most profound lesson that the prisoners took away was not in the medical records, but in the eyes of their handlers. A look that didn't ask who you served, only if you still felt pain. Reports from the time show that among German nurses a new language emerged. Some have taken to writing Mensch, human, instead of prisoner in their journals. Others abandoned terms such as degenerate and subhuman, replacing them with patient, colleague, professional. It was a slow but real mutation, and it was not born of speeches. It was born from practice, of the gesture, from the presence of a system that, instead of retaliating, rehabilitated. The irony is that this moral transformation did not come from American weakness, as the Nazi propagandists so proclaimed. It came from his strength, the ability to take care of your own soldiers, and at the same time, the enemy, to keep stocks for the army and still offer food to starving civilians, to produce cutting-edge medical technology and share it with those who, months before, pointed guns at them. This is what the Reich would never understand, that true power is not in destruction, but in reconstruction. And as the front advanced toward Berlin, as the bombs fell and the flags shifted, a parallel war was being won in the white corridors of Allied medicine, a war where compassion replaced doctrine, where knowledge cured more than propaganda poisoned, and where, finally, the enemy ceased to be a threat, to become an apprentice. But history still held its last irony, because even after treaties were signed and nations liberated, there was a judgment that humanity needed to make, not with weapons, but with evidence, not against armies, but against ideas. It was time for medicine to not only heal but to witness, because at the Nuremberg tribunal the lab coats would be interrogated, and the question would not be who won the war, but who saved the life. Germany had fallen for many reasons: strategic mistakes, doctrinal arrogance, intelligence failures. But of all the factors, one proved inescapable. It underestimated the noiseless machine. While the Reich invested in rockets and symbols, the United States supplied hospitals, trained nurses, and transported plasma across continents. In the end, the German ideological and military collapse came not only from the weapons they lacked, but from the medicine they could not imagine. The nurses who emerged from the Cherbourg caves were not defeated violently. They were won by contrast. And this contrast was absolute, between doctrine and reason, between planned scarcity and industrial abundance, between blind obedience and critical science. In the end, the biggest shock wasn't technological, it was moral. American medicine has proven that care is also strategy, that healing can be an act of power, and that in certain wars, saving lives disarms more than 1,000 tanks. This is the great lesson. Logistics determines strategy, but it is ethics that determines victory. A system that cares for everyone is stronger than one that decides who deserves to live. As General Heinz Guderian admitted in his last account after the surrender, we were defeated by trucks and by syringes. If you believe that history needs to be told with rigor, ethics, and truth, enjoy this video. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. And tell us in the comments, what was the most shocking data you discovered here? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.